Hey friend, welcome back. It's Karla Lee here with Voice4Kids. Let's dive in and listen to the Child's Mindset podcast number 4. Voice4Kids, the raw, real truth of co-parenting through your child's eyes. I'm your host, Karla Lee, and it's time to hear their voice. Welcome to the Voice4Kids podcast. Hey friend, welcome back. We are on podcast number 4 with Voice4Kids, and this one is actually about the child's mindset, which I think is really important that we know what's in the mind of the child. Obviously, it's not easy to know what they're thinking, what's going on in there. You could be thinking, oh my gosh, are they happy? Are they sad? What's going on? Let's be honest, we just sometimes don't know. But I'm here to help you today because obviously I've been that child going through separation and divorce. I know what was going on in my mind and it wasn't easy. There were so many different thoughts going on. For me, I remember, as I said, I was 9, I was so confused. I didn't know what was happening. What's really going on in my family? When they say they're separating, what does that actually mean, that they're separating? At my age, I was thinking, does that mean they're just not together, now, today, and tomorrow everything's okay? We don't always understand really what they're talking about when we're young. Imagine what it's like for a little child, say a 5-year-old. They wouldn't comprehend any of this. So, they might see it as just like, oh, mummy and daddy are fighting, and mummy and daddy are okay tomorrow. Different mindset. Obviously, a teenager might have heard a lot of arguments and would think differently. But for me, it was very confusing. I remember not understanding what they're really talking about. I didn't really understand what the future meant. I was so confused. I was angry. I was frustrated. I thought I was totally out of control. I had no say in any of this. Why my family? My mind was going everywhere. I really did not understand what was going on. And I think the worst thing for me was just the fact that my parents didn't argue. They didn't argue in front of me at all. I can never recall one argument. It was years later, I said to my mum, I never heard you argue. She said, because we didn't. She said, your father said how it was, and I just had to go with it. There was no argument from me. And that's why she did eventually have a nervous breakdown, because she said she bottled up everything. Or she thought her own voice. There was no voice, she said, of hers. And it was years later she finally said, I've had enough. But as she said, she wished years earlier that she did have a voice. She wished she did say something. She wished she did know how to have the strength to do it. But obviously not everyone does know how to do it. And back in the 80s, you may know if you are older, that back in those days, divorce was a taboo thing. You didn't get divorced. You stayed in that situation. So to step out of it was really quite difficult for people back in those days. So for me, it was just a difficult situation. I really didn't know what to think about it. I didn't know if I could talk to anyone about it. I remember being at school and thinking, no one here's going through this. Though my cousin had been through it, but his situation, I wouldn't say, to me, seemed to do anything that upset him, because I never saw him upset. So I was kind of didn't even think to talk to him about it, but I was just stuck in my own bubble. I'd be in class and I didn't know what to think of anything. I'd be confused about what was going on. I remember sitting in a comprehension class. So obviously back in the days when you're little, kids put on the headphones and you read a book and you go through that book, and you have to take the headphones off after listening to the story, and you have to put down, what did you comprehend from that story, and write down your thoughts. And I remember so many times I was, because I was 9 and I was just going through all that stuff at home, I just didn't really get, I wasn't connected. I wasn't connected in school, I wasn't connected in class. I didn't care what was going on. My world was totally in shutdown mode, but I didn't know I could talk to the teacher. I didn't know I could say anything to anyone. I didn't feel like I had permission to. So for me, I felt very, very closed down. So the reason I want to talk to you about this today is because it's so important that, obviously, I said you've had the talk, but now it's following up this child. What is in their mind, understanding what's in their mind. But the only way you're going to understand what's in their mind is if you communicate to them and if you talk to them and if you ask them and you regularly go back to them, don't assume having one conversation is all done and dusted and you can just move on and they're okay and they'll be fine and everything's going to be good, smooth sailing from here. I would not say that at all. It's really important that you do a thing called follow-up. So for me, when I think back to all the different situations of what it was like to go through in my parents' separation, I relate it to like a death. Okay, that something in my life died, something in my life ended, and for a lot of kids, it seems like it's like an end to an era, an end to a season. And it's really important that you understand that for them, their family is everything to them, and suddenly this thing has just died. It's just ended. And it's ended either really abruptly, like for me, it was abruptly. My parents didn't fight, so it was just abruptly ended. For some kids, they've had their parents fight and fight and fight and argue like every day. There could be domestic violence. There could be physical throwing of objects. There could be just bad words that are said all the time, swearing, things like that for some kids. But so some kids might be a little bit more prepared that this could be on the cards, this could happen. But for some kids, they just don't see it coming. So it is like a death to them, and you have to recognize, what a death feels like. So you as a parent maybe have lost a family member, and you know what that feeling's like when you suddenly have that loss, when you suddenly have that grief. Now that loss and grief isn't something that necessarily just dies overnight. It could be an ongoing thing. It goes on for weeks, it goes on for months, some people it goes on for years. That is the same for a child. Do not think that the child isn't feeling the same way, if not more, because this is their mother and their father. They've lost something that's probably the most important thing to them. So they're grieving this thing. They're grieving. Can they grieve in front of you? I don't know. Can they grieve in front of you? This is a question you have to ask yourself. Have you opened that door for them to grieve in front of you? Or is it something they have to do behind closed doors? For me, I had to do it behind closed doors. It was never a discussion after my parents separated. We never talked about it. So for me, I had to just, every night go to bed, close my door and grieve. I grieved and grieved and I cried into the same pillow. And that pillow, let me tell you, that pillow that I had from that little girl was a comforter to me because I kept it until I was 22, that same pillow, because it had memories of the tears that I cried for my mother. I remember there'd be nights where I was so upset and I just, roll over, and my brother was only in the next room. He was only next door, and I didn't want him to hear me cry because he never spoke to me about how he felt from the separation. And I just thought, okay, no one seems to be crying in my family. No one seems to be upset. I've just got to deal with this myself. Obviously, I can't talk to anyone about it. So I remember at night I'd just roll over and I'd just cry into my pillow as quietly as I could. And my pillow, I remember, would be so drenched, so wet. And I'd have to find a spot on my pillow that wasn't wet so I could go to sleep, because after I'd cried all my tears and I was totally exhausted, my pillow was so drenched I'd have to find the spot on the pillow that wasn't wet so I could finally go to sleep. It was a really traumatic time for me. And I went through a lot of stages of wetting the bed and things like that, and that was because of the trauma that I went through. I'd get up in the middle of the night and I'd strip my bed and I'd take the wet sheets and I'd throw them in the washing machine and hide them underneath so that my dad wouldn't know, and I'd hope that my sheets would dry by the morning so he wouldn't know. Obviously they would smell, but I was only 9, I was only a little girl, and I was just like, so upset that I would do that, that I'd keep having that trauma and making the bed in the middle of the night, trying so my dad wouldn't know that I did that. But I'm sure my dad knew what was going on, but they didn't realize it was a trauma. I was never given any counselling. I was never given help in that way, and that's really important. I think that when you must see the signs of the trauma. You must see the signs. If your child's bedwetting all of a sudden, if they're shutting off and they're not talking, there's signs. They are calling out. They are crying out for your help. So it's really important that you look for those and don't just assume that children are coping. Kids only think of today. They only think of today. They're only in the present. They're only in the present moment. They're not thinking of tomorrow. They're not thinking of the future. They're thinking of today. But you must think ahead for them. Are they coping? Should I check in with them? Yes, you should check in with them. See how they're going. Just ask them things like, are you okay? I'm here. My door's open. Do you want to talk? Because their mind is going around and around, and they need direction. They need direction of what's, because there's so much happening, but the direction might need to come from you. You might need to sit down with them and say to them, look, if you want to talk about this, we can catch up, once a week. Even if it's a teenager, do you want to sit down and just have a chat and do it really in a really non-informative way? Don't make it like it's a formal thing around the dinner table and it's just, you might go to a park and sit there and have a conversation with them, but really think about where you do it and the way you do it and how you do it, because their emotions are everywhere. They're so frustrated. They're so frustrated inside because, why is this happening to me? Why did this happen to me? Why couldn't it have been someone else? They were the same emotions and feelings that I had. I was so frustrated and I was angry because I'd go to school and I'd see all these other kids that looked so happy. And, I remember going home of an afternoon and throwing my bag, into this empty house because my mother wasn't there anymore. And I remember getting the telephone and I'd just be dialing all my different friends to see who was home and what are you doing? Can I come and play? I just wanted to get out of that empty. It was a house. It was no longer a home. It was a house. I just wanted to get out of there. So I remember just going to my friend's house and I'd be there all afternoon. My home time was to be always home by 5:30. And I remember I'd just stay at their house and their mother was in the house and their mother's usually cooking afternoon tea and doing things like a mother would in the house. And I missed that. It was lonely for me. And I just loved going to my friends' houses to see that female in the house, the presence of a woman in the house, because I missed that. I was longing for that and I missed it. And so for me, it was, just difficult. I remember my mother used to do my hair and now my dad was doing my hair. I had these perfect, pigtails and all of a sudden my dad was doing them. One was here and one was here. And it was tormenting to me. It was tormenting to me because I had this perfect hair every day for school and all of a sudden my mum couldn't do it anymore. She wasn't there. And, I know my dad was probably trying his best, but it just wasn't the same. I remember I just had all this hair was just like bumps everywhere because my dad didn't know how to comb the bumps out and he did his best. And we had a thing back in those days called baubles where you'd have to put the pigtail up and, take the bauble around and he'd lose the bauble and it'd flick back and hit me in the head. And, it was difficult and doing the cooking, and it was difficult for me. My mind was just like, I knew how my mother cooked and she cooked my food a certain way. My dad would make me these really big dinner plates of food and, my mum knew the proportion, what portion she should put on the plate. And suddenly I went from, the portion that I could handle as a little girl to my father putting like 5 Brussels sprouts and dead potato and chuck steak, and the meal was so big on my plate. And I remember I was just sitting there thinking, I can't eat all this. But my dad was so strict and I had to eat it. That was the rule. I had to eat the food. There was no going back. There was just like, that's your food and you've got to eat it. And I sat there so many times thinking, no, where's my mum? Where's my mum? My mum knows I can't eat this much food. It was so difficult because I couldn't verbally tell my dad this stuff. My dad was not the type of person that I could just say this to and he'd be okay, that's okay. I just couldn't say that. And my dad had a saying at the dinner table, sit up, eat up and shut up. Pretty much that was it. You just sat there, you didn't talk and you ate. And I can remember so many nights, my father would finish dinner, my brother would finish dinner and off they'd go. And I'd still be sitting there as a little girl at the table an hour later, sometimes an hour and a half later, still trying to eat this cold food because I had to eat everything on my plate. And it got to the stage where I knew I had to get strategic about how I'm going to not eat this food but act like I'm eating this food. And I remember grabbing serviettes off the side of the bench, which were right next to me. And every time my dad would walk past, I'd be chewing. And every time he walked away, I'd be spitting, the meat into the serviettes and rolling them up in balls and putting them in my lap. And I'd be hiding my legs under the dinner table. And I remember sometimes I'd look down, I had 5 serviette balls of food. So much food because I hated Brussels sprouts. Dead potato was like a fake mashed potato that you put like a seasoning pack in. It wasn't like fresh mashed potato. And I remember just like looking down and seeing all this and thinking, okay, now I've got to get from the dinner table to the garbage bin, which was right around the bench, and into the pantry, there was the bin. And I'd have to listen really carefully and think, when's my dad not coming down those stairs? Because half the time he'd be upstairs in his bedroom. And I'd get up really quietly and I'd sneak down and I'd go around the bench and I'd go around to the bin and I'd look in the bin and I'd lift up all the rubbish in the bin and I'd throw all my food underneath and squash the other stuff on top. And I thought, wow, I've worked it out. I've worked out what to do. I've worked out what to do. And when I can't eat my food, I just got to sit here a little bit longer. I've got to make sure there's serviettes there, and this is what I've got to do. Can you imagine my mind? Every time I had meals, this was the thought that I was going through when I didn't like what I was eating, because I couldn't tell my dad I didn't like what I was eating, because for him it was just about the fact that he'd gone to the effort, he'd made the food, and I had to eat it. This is forgetting that I'm a little girl, forgetting maybe there's some things I don't like. My mum probably knew what I didn't like. My dad didn't know. She knew what portion to put on my plate. He didn't know what portion to put on my plate. There was all these little things. My mind was always rattling around, just trying to deal with the changes, and it was so difficult because I became anxious. I was frustrated. I was bitter. There was just emotions after emotions. I was dealing with things at school. There was a lot of changes at schools. I didn't know how to come home and tell my dad all these changes that were happening at school sometimes, because he wasn't always, for me at the time, my primary parent that I could come home and say things to. So it was just one thing after other. And I know there was times that I would be thinking to myself, I wish they would ask me if I was okay. I wish they would ask me if I was okay, because I wasn't, but I didn't know how to express it because the question was never given to me. And it's important that you give that question to your children. Are you okay? Because I never had that invitation. And that invitation is so important because it helps a child know that they've got an outlet. Someone does care. Someone wants to know how I feel. I don't just look at everyone else and wondering how they feel. I've got someone actually asking how I feel. And I wanted to be free to talk about it. I wanted to be free to talk about how I was feeling. I remember those many times I was missing my mum and I was crying, missing my mum, like I said, in the pillow. And I wanted to scream, I miss my mum, I miss my mum. But I didn't feel like I had that platform to do that. I didn't feel like my dad would be happy if I said that. I thought he'd probably be angry if I said that, because there was no conversation, there was no communication on how I was feeling. Are you missing your mum? I understand if you are. If I was given that, I would have probably just cried. I would have cried so much because I was missing my mum. I was missing that feminine touch. I was missing that person that was always around me. And it was difficult for me to feel like I had a voice. I really felt like I was muzzled. I felt like I had to just suck it all up and take it all in. I felt like I had no choice. I felt like it was not my place to be able to say how I felt, because there was no communication. There was none. There was zero communication. And that pretty much put me into shutdown, put me into a place where I just thought, I'm not going to be heard. No one's going to listen. No one cares. This is how it is. This is how my life's going to go. And I have to accept this is the new way my family's going to run. And it was so difficult. It's really important that you stop and ask yourself, do I want that for my child? Do I want my child to feel like they've got no one to talk to? Do I want my child to feel that, I'm not a door for them to open up and freely have a conversation with? Of course you don't. Of course you don't. You should never feel that way. You should always be someone that says, when you knock on my door is open to you. Our children's brains are always growing. And remember that trauma for a child, the brain stops at that point. I know my brain stopped at 9. It stopped in a certain way, because I know when I look at the most significant time of my life, when anyone says to me, even today, what's your most memorable childhood memory? It's not a good one, sadly. It's not a good one. I just go back to 9, sitting in the lounge room and my parents telling me they're separating. That's exactly where my mind goes every time someone says a childhood memory. It's usually a trauma. It's not usually something that's like, I went to Disneyland. It's not usually. Most kids, it'll be a traumatic event because it's actually done something in the brain and it's given a significant memory. But that memory can, I believe, be healed in a way that that trauma is lifted to a point where it becomes a memory, but it doesn't become something that's so traumatic. Like for me, over the years of things that I've done and why I've done Voice for Kids is because I turned my mess into a message. I took all the trauma, I took all the pain, I took all the hurt, I took all the things that were happened to me, and I knew that there was a better way things could have been handled. I knew there was a better way my parents could have spoken to me. I knew if some parents had tools and information and they understood how it was for me as one child, okay, one child, but many children feel the same way. It's a different circumstance, it could be a different situation, but the feelings and emotions are pretty much the same. You can actually turn this around for your child in the early stages. Obviously, if it's years later, yes, you can still have those conversations of asking for forgiveness. I'm not sure what you went through. I probably didn't ask you, and I'm asking you to forgive me of that. But when you're in the early stages, you can walk your child through this pain. You can walk with them because you are also going through the pain. You are also going through the trauma. You also know what it feels like. It is no different. They are just a human being of a younger age. That's all they are. They're just a human being of a younger age. And their brain is nowhere near to the growth that yours is. So could you imagine how difficult it is for them to download all this information and understand? A lot more difficult because they're still growing. And then the trauma in the brain at the time that they're young, say 9 for me, that trauma is growing with the brain. So the brain's growing, obviously to a certain stage, but that trauma is still there. And if that trauma is not dealt with, if it's not talked through and communicated through and brought to a place of like healing and letting go, it just sits there and it stays there. And it doesn't matter how old you get. I've spoken to so many adults that are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they can tell me exactly what it was like to go back to that pain at that age of 5, 10, 12, whatever they were. And if they have never dealt with it and never spoken about it, they tell me how real that trauma still is, and it's still sitting there. And it's like a rock. It's like a rock. And you want that rock to become like flesh. You want it to become soft. You want it to be manipulated to a stage that thing can start to be dealt with. You can start to open up. You can start to see what's inside, deal with those things inside, and start to work through those things inside, talk through those things, and let them go. Because letting go of those things, letting go of that trauma is a really, really good healing thing for you inside. I know for me, when I went through some counselling and obviously through my stages of writing and things like that, that was really releasing for me. Like journaling was really good. But when I started writing my book, that was a really good healing stage for me. But I know that there's many parents that are listening right now and you're wondering, what is your child thinking? What are they really, really thinking? I'm telling you, they're wondering what happened. What is the truth of what happened? Why did this really happen? Were they told the truth? Have you told them the truth? Don't manifest something that didn't happen. Just talk to them in their language. Give them an understanding of what happened. Release their mind from wondering. Release their mind from thinking up a scenario of what happened. Sometimes kids talk, parents talk, cousins talk, aunties and uncles talk. And they'll give you a scenario, or they'll give your child a scenario of what happened. I think this is actually really what happened with your mum and dad. You don't want that to happen. You have to be the one that talks to your child. Don't let someone else tell your child a scenario, because it could be the wrong one. And that's the worst thing, that they're suddenly on the wrong story. So why I'm talking to you today is because I want you to understand that the child's mindset is so important. That their mind is pure and clean of anything that's wrong, like anything that's false, that's been given to them that's a wrong story. Do not let that happen. Sit down, talk to them, communicate with them. Keep it as an ongoing thing. Communication is so key. It is so key when separation and divorce happens for children. But you must keep the line open. It's like a phone line, okay? When you have a phone line, to say from you to your husband or to your wife or to your mother or your father, there's a phone line, right? You pick up the phone, you can call that person straight away. That phone line is there at all times. It's always connected. It's the same thing for a child to a parent. You must keep that phone line open. Don't ever shut it off. Don't disconnect it. Make sure you pay the bill so you can keep calling that child. And when I say pay the bill, that means make sure that you are going to make sure that you're accountable to that child. You're accountable to make sure that bill's paid, because you must pay that bill because that phone line must stay open. And that's accountability. Paying the bill is accountability. When you pay an electricity company, that's accountability. You pay it because you've got to keep that phone line open. Could you imagine if your phone line wasn't open, you need to ring a hospital and it's an emergency? You must keep that phone line open. What if your child was at home and you were somewhere and your child had to ring 000 for some reason because there's a fire in the house? You must pay that bill. That's accountability for your child. It's no different. You must keep the phone line open for your child. It's so, so important. So I just want to share this with you today because I really believe that the child's mindset is so, so important. For me, obviously years later, I've had to just walk through this journey on my own. I've walked through it, I've had my time with my mum, talking through a lot of things. I haven't had that time with my dad, and I still haven't had that time with my dad. My dad hasn't been in my life for over 22 years, and that's something that I've had to accept. I've had to accept that. But I know from what I've been through, from the time I've had with my mum talking and my own healing process, that it's so important that kids have that open channel with both their parents. And it's not about bickering and working out whose story is right. It's just about being truthful, being open. It's not about giving your story to your kids about, this is what happened to me. No, this is not about you. This is about saying, I'm here, my door's open, what do you need to ask me? And it's about giving them the truth, the wholehearted truth with purity and honesty. So I really hope you enjoyed this podcast number 4. The child's mindset is so important. So I encourage you, please, if you know someone, if you're listening because you're thinking of someone and you want to encourage them to see this, please send this to them, because it's so important that they hear this. But it's even more important that you choose to communicate with your children. Get inside the mind of your child. It is so, so important. So that's the end of podcast number 4. I really hope you enjoyed the child's mindset. And coming up next, we have family and school involvement. This is an important one because your children do struggle at times with other family members and their school involvement. And it's really important that we understand that the struggles that they're having are real. They're not just inside the home, but also outside the home. So I'll catch you on the next podcast. This is Karla Lee with Voice4Kids. See you soon.